You wake up to a new day and, for a brief moment, believe that something has changed. The air feels different, the body lighter, and the mind promises that this time it will be a different story. But before mid-morning, the old script returns. The same reactions, the same thoughts disguised as novelty. What repeats itself is not the world, but the inner vibration that sustains it. This is the blind spot in the search for change, trying to move the pieces on the board without realizing that the board is within. Quantum transformation begins when consciousness stops chasing the new and learns to observe the energy that creates it. It's the moment when the cycle reveals itself not as a prison, but as an invitation to reprogram one's own field. There is an almost imperceptible moment when the excitement for change turns into uncomfortable silence. It's the instant when you realize that despite all your efforts, something keeps pulling you back to the same point. You move to a new city, a new relationship, a new career, adopt new habits, study methods, read books on personal transformation. But as time passes, the pattern returns, disguised in new forms. The pain lies not only in the failure of external change, but in the feeling of helplessness that invades the body, as if something within you remains programmed to repeat what you most wish to avoid. This pain is unlike any other. It doesn't scream. It doesn't show itself openly. It seeps through the gaps between thoughts, in the pauses of conversations, in the hours when the world sleeps, and only the echo of what hasn't yet been transformed remains. It is the pain of being lucid enough to perceive the cycle, but not conscious enough to break it. This internal friction between what is known and what is lived generates a kind of energetic exhaustion, a fatigue that is not physical, but vibrational. The cycle doesn't repeat because life is unfair. It repeats because the vibration that originated, it is still active within the field you emit. Every thought, emotion, and expectation acts as a code that reality reads and returns in the form of experience. The rational mind, accustomed to control, tries to resolve the pattern with effort and willpower, but that is precisely the fuel that feeds it. The more you fight against what is, the more energy you give to the same vibrational state you wish to transcend. The pain of repetition is not punishment, it is reflection. It shows where consciousness is still asleep. It shows that there's a part of you that has grown accustomed to what is familiar, even if that familiarity is painful, because on some level, suffering also offers safety. It is predictable. The mind prefers familiar suffering to the uncertainty of the void that comes with the new. That is why true change feels so difficult. It requires letting go of what is known as me. Hi. In moments of clarity, you might even observe this movement. You feel a genuine intention to change, but soon fear seeps in. Fear of losing control, of dissolving, of no longer recognizing yourself. Then the old pattern reappears as a safe harbor. And in that instant, the pain becomes sharp, realizing that the prison is not outside but within. Sustained by emotional memories the body still carries. The mind tries to solve through reasoning what can only be released through presence. It analyzes, compares, judges, but does not feel. Quantum change doesn't occur through intellectually understanding the pattern, but through observing without resistance the energetic field that sustains it. As long as pain is fought, it will remain. When it is observed without identification, it begins to lose density. Think of a river that always runs through the same bed. The water wants to flow, but the path has been shaped by time, by stones, by the force of past events. As long as consciousness identifies with the riverbed, the flow will remain predictable. But when you realize you are the water itself, and not the path, the possibility of a new course arises. This realization doesn't happen magically or suddenly, but as a subtle shift of energy. It's the moment when something within you yields and allows the flow to take a new direction. Pain, in this process, is a portal. It points precisely to where the energy is trapped. When you feel it fully, without seeking explanation, the field begins to reorganize. The old vibration loses power because it is finally seen. And what is seen with awareness cannot remain the same. Many mistake this stage for failure. They think, if I'm repeating, it's because I haven't evolved. But repetition is part of the observation process. It is the mind persistently showing the point of incoherence between what is desired and what is vibrated. When that recognition occurs without guilt, a new space arises, a kind of silence where the field becomes flexible again. Recognizing the cycle is painful, but also liberating, because in that moment, you stop being a victim of circumstances and begin to see yourself as their unconscious creator. Suffering then ceases to be an enemy and becomes a frequency indicator. Every time pain arises, it reveals the vibrational tone that still seeks adjustment. The beginning of true quantum change is paradoxical. It begins when you stop trying to change the world and decide instead to change the vibration with which you observe it. This doesn't mean passivity, but presence. The observer who learns to hold discomfort without reacting to it begins to dissolve the repetition program. Pain loses its meaning because it's no longer the sign of a prison, but the evidence that consciousness is awakening. When the old cycle reappears, it no longer dominates you. It merely visits, and each visit becomes an opportunity for alignment. It's at this point that transformation ceases to be a promise and begins to become a state. The new is not something to seek. It's something to sustain, vibrating at another frequency. The cycle is broken not by force, but by internal coherence. The mind is a structure of survival, not expansion. It was shaped to repeat what has worked before, even if it no longer makes sense. Its primary impulse is to protect the body and maintain the coherence of identity, not to allow the quantum leap. That's why, when you try to leave an old pattern, it reacts as if defending its very life. Repetition is the way the mind has found to preserve the illusion of stability, and that illusion is the main obstacle to vibrational change. The mind does not distinguish between pain and safety. It distinguishes between known and unknown. Everything familiar is perceived as safe, even if it's dysfunctional. That's why, when consciousness tries to update the field, the mind activates subtle mechanisms of return. It argues, justifies, creates distractions, and above all, generates doubt. Analytical thinking, which should serve observation, becomes a maze in which creative energy disperses. This is how the old vibration perpetuates itself. Every time the mind relives a memory and attaches emotion to it, it reactivates the same energetic field. The body responds to that command, as if the event were happening again. The heart races, breathing changes, muscles tense, and the chemistry of the past reinstalls itself. In that instant, the present becomes only a stage for a memory. It's in this invisible process that quantum change is interrupted, not for lack of desire, but for lack of vibrational coherence between what is thought and what is felt. The mind believes that thinking about the new is the same as vibrating the new, but thought is merely a tool of vibration, not its source. True frequency arises from the internal state, and the internal state is defined by what is felt and sustained, not by what is imagined. As long as the mind tries to make change happen, it prevents it, because it operates from control. Control is always an attempt to keep the known alive. Quantum change is not reasoning. It is a collapse of patterns. For this collapse to occur, the observer must suspend the need to understand. The mind feeds on explanations, but consciousness feeds on presence. Presence doesn't seek meaning. It simply perceives what is. When the observer stops reacting and simply observes, the field of possibilities reopens. It's the moment when the old pattern begins to lose strength because it no longer receives emotional energy. The mind fears emptiness because within it, it has no function. That's why, when you try to be silent, thoughts multiply. It's the mind trying to reaffirm its existence. It confuses itself with you and believes that stopping thought is dying. But in truth, it is in that space between thoughts that the quantum field manifests itself in its purest form. Silence is not the absence of life. It is the matrix of all creation. The challenge is to recognize that the mind is not the enemy. It is merely a tool out of context. It was designed to respond to the physical world, but quantum change requires that the command come from another level, the level of the observing consciousness. When the mind understands that it is not being denied but repositioned, it begins to calm down. Resistance dissolves, and the energy that was once used for defense becomes available for creation. It's at this point that many give up. When the mind screams, the body reacts, and everything seems to regress. But what's truly happening is deprogramming. The field is being rewritten, and the mind feels that as a threat. It tries to restore the old vibration because that's what it knows. The observer must move through this noise without identifying with it. The mind speaks in the language of fear. Consciousness responds in silence. Think of the mind as an antenna that has been tuned for years to a specific frequency. Even if you decide to change the station, static still lingers for a while. That doesn't mean the new frequency doesn't exist. It means the receiver is still adjusting. The noise is part of the transition. Every moment you perceive the noise without reacting, the tuning refines. The old vibration remains active because the observer continues to believe that thoughts are facts. When you realize that thought is merely energetic movement, it loses its power. What once felt like solid truth becomes only a wave passing through a neutral field. And in that instant, something new can emerge. The mind doesn't block change out of malice, but out of loyalty to the story it learned to protect. It was built upon experiences, pains, beliefs, and conclusions. Each of these layers forms a vibrational signature. When consciousness begins to awaken, those layers reorganize. It's as if the building of identity starts to shake. The natural tendency is to reinforce the walls, but true liberation occurs when you allow the structure to dismantle and the inner space to expand. The old vibration is sustained by the need for continuity. The quantum leap requires interruption. It's not about destroying the mind, but allowing it to become transparent, an instrument in service of perception, not its center. When the mind ceases to be the conductor and becomes the observed, energy redistributes itself. The old frequency, deprived of emotional fuel, begins to dissolve. Quantum change happens when the mind is repositioned in its natural place, a recording tool, not a command center. In this state, the observer stops thinking in order to exist and begins to think from existence itself. It's a silent, almost imperceptible inversion, but profoundly transformative. The new vibration doesn't need to be created. It has always been there, merely covered by the noise of a mind that insists on repeating itself. There comes a moment when the body becomes the most honest mirror of what the mind tries to hide. The weight on the shoulders, the tightness in the chest, the short breath. Each sign is a silent confession that something inside you is exhausted. It isn't just physical fatigue, it is a vibrational exhaustion. The entire system seems tired of sustaining the same emotional frequency. Repetition ceases to be merely mental and becomes a symptom. It is the body saying it can no longer bear to vibrate in the same pattern of pain, fear, or lack. This weariness has a bittersweet taste. On one hand, it feels like an end. On the other, it is the beginning of something new. It is when the mind's mechanism can no longer find energy to keep the cycle active. The old vibration starts to unravel through saturation. You try to revive the same justifications, the same internal narratives, but they no longer have the same power. The feeling is of being in familiar territory that has lost its meaning. It's like repeating a word so many times that it loses its meaning. The pattern still manifests, but the energetic bond with it begins to break. However, before liberation comes, the collapse. The body feels the impact of the transition. Old emotions surface, forgotten memories return with force, and there are moments when everything seems to get worse. It is the natural movement of energy when it begins to reorganize. The vibrational field, when observed, releases what was being held. This release, though painful, is the first sign that something deep is changing. The mind, unable to understand this process, tries to catalog what it feels. It calls it relapse, sadness, confusion. But in essence, it is a realignment. The pain that reappears is not a setback. It is energetic residue being dissolved. Each emotion relived is a layer of density leaving the body. The weariness that accompanies this stage is the signature of cleansing. It is at this point that many give up, when the sense of emptiness becomes too intense. The old no longer serves, but the new has not yet settled. It is a crossing without a map. The impulse to go back to what was is strong, because the unknown seems threatening. Yet it is precisely here that the call to change at an energetic level becomes audible. It is no longer about adjusting behaviors or thoughts. It is about changing the quality of the energy that sustains your field. To change energetically is to accept that it is not possible to heal from the same frequency that created the pain. It is to recognize that each recurring emotion, anger, fear, guilt, frustration, is a vibration that feeds on itself. As long as you react to it, you continue to emit the same signal. The leap occurs when, for the first time, you feel the emotion without merging with it. Instead of reacting, you observe. Instead of identifying, you witness. In that instant, something inside disconnects from the cycle. The energy that once circulated in a closed circuit finds an exit. The call to change at an energetic level doesn't come in words. It arises as a different kind of silence, a pause amid the inner noise. It is consciousness inviting you to stop fighting what you feel and begin to sustain presence before what is. This presence has transformative power because it interrupts vibrational feedback. When consciousness stabilizes in the now, the old energy loses its command. Weariness, which once seemed like weakness, reveals itself as a sign of readiness. It indicates that the body and soul no longer accept vibrating in dissonant frequencies. The old state of alert begins to dissolve, and with it, the constant need to control everything. A new perception arises. What needs to change is not the world, but the inner field that projects it. At this stage, it is common to feel periods of deep emotional silence. The mind tries to interpret them as apathy, but in truth, it is the energetic system entering recalibration. The absence of intense emotion is not indifference, it is neutrality emerging. This neutrality is the 0 point of quantum transformation, the place where the old pattern finally has nothing left to lean on. The call then becomes a natural movement. You begin to perceive repeated situations not as threats, but as opportunities to stabilize the new frequency. Each time the old emotion tries to return, you recognize it and choose to remain present. There is no repression, no escape. There is observation. This simple change of posture alters the energetic signature of your field. The body responds with relief, the breath deepens, and a sense of inner space expands. True change does not begin with understanding, but with surrender. Surrendering is not giving up. It is ceasing the effort to control the frequency. It is allowing the new pattern to reveal itself in the silence of the field, without the mind's interference. When this happens, weariness turns into lightness. The body, once exhausted from sustaining the density of the past, begins to vibrate at another cadence. It is a living stillness, a sense of being present without needing to do anything. The weariness of reliving the same feelings is the clearest sign that the cycle is the edge of dissolution. It is the point at which consciousness begins to retake energetic command. When the observer aligns with the flow of energy, repetition ceases for lack of resonance. What was weight becomes open field. Life then responds in kind. External circumstances begin to reflect the new internal state. And what once was struggle becomes dance. Not the dance of the mind that tries to lead, but of the energy that has finally found freedom to move. The turning point usually arrives in silence. After so many frustrated attempts to change the world, something inside grows tired of pushing the pieces and starts to look at the board. You realize that life does not move because the external changes, but because the internal vibration changes. Each reaction, each repeated emotion, each unmet expectation, all of them obey an invisible field that starts from within. The discovery doesn't come as a theory, but as a real shift in perception. What seemed outside was always inside. Until then, your gaze was fixed on the scenery, people, situations, time. You believed that if something out there adjusted, peace would come. But the repetition of the same plots shows the opposite. Circumstances are merely translations of the energy you emit. What manifests is not what you want, but what you vibrate. When this truth passes through the body, the world ceases to be the enemy to be defeated and becomes the mirror of consciousness itself. This realization does not bring euphoria, it brings stillness. Because the instant you recognize the inner field as the origin, all responsibility returns to the center. There is no longer anywhere to point the finger. Anger, guilt, resentment, fear, all reveal themselves merely as frequencies that still inhabit the field and therefore continue to generate compatible realities. The observer begins to understand that experiences are not punishments but vibrational measurements. They show what the field is emitting. For years, the mind believed that thinking differently would be enough to transform life. It changed phrases, repeated mantras, imagined ideal scenarios, but nothing holds when the body vibrates in another tone. The quantum field does not respond to words, it responds to coherence. When feeling contradicts thought, the dominant vibration wins. That is why true change begins where discourse ends, in the silence of the inner field. The observer who awakens to this understanding begins to gather the energy that used to be projected onto the world. The need to control others weakens. The search for validation dissolves. Attention, which used to scatter across everything happening outside, turns inward like a concentrated beam of light. The question changes. It stops being, "Why is this happening to me?" and becomes, "What is this revealing about me?" This inversion is the beginning of energetic mastery. You begin to see that every situation that bothers you is a chance to calibrate the field. The anger that arises, the fear that tightens, the anxiety that speeds up. These are all vibrational indicators, not enemies. The observer who learns to read these signals begins to perceive life as a panel of constant feedback. Nothing happens against you. Everything happens to show where the field still vibrates out of tune. From there, transformation stops depending on effort. When the inner field changes, circumstances reorganize by natural coherence. External energy has no choice but to follow the new vibrational state. This process is not linear or immediate. It is organic, like a flower blooming. Each insight opens a bit more space. Each inner silence stabilizes the new frequency. The mind tries to understand, but the understanding does not fit into words. It is a knowing felt in the body. The heart slows, time widens, the need to react disappears. Reality remains in motion, but you stop oscillating with the center stabilizes. The observer begins to perceive that true power does not lie in interfering with circumstances, but in sustaining the vibration you wish to see reflected in them. This realization brings a kind of humility the mind does not know. Pride dissolves because there is no longer a battle to win. Consciousness understands that it was always the one generating the waves the world returned. Each person, each conflict, each loss was merely an energetic translation of what needed light. When the observer embraces this truth, compassion arises. The other ceases to be the mirror that provokes and becomes the mirror that teaches. Life, seen from this point, becomes a laboratory. Each experience becomes a vibrational experiment. The observer stops identifying with the role and begins to study the field that creates the role. When something throws you off balance, you observe the energetic movement that arises there and follow it until it dissolves. This pure observation is the true agent of change. The old vibration, deprived of the energy of reaction, begins to weaken. The inner field, when observed without resistance, reprograms itself. What was once density becomes flow. The body responds with lightness, and time seems to align. Encounters change, words change, opportunities appear without effort, not because the world has become more favorable, but because the field has become more coherent. The observer finally understands that the universe does not need to be convinced. It simply responds. Quantum change begins the moment consciousness stops waiting for the world to transform and decides to transform the tone of its own emission. At this point, the external loses the power to define the internal. The creator returns to the center of their own field, and everything around inevitably begins to reorganize. Collapse does not arrive with a warning. It happens in the midst of routine. When something that used to shake you no longer has the same impact, you still notice the old impulse arising, the fear, the rush, the need to justify yourself. But there is a pause that didn't exist before. This pause is the first sign that the old energy has lost its hold. The mind tries to react, but the body doesn't obey in the same way. The pattern still appears, but it no longer finds enough vibrational echo to sustain itself. It's like trying to light a flame in an oxygenless environment. The collapse of the old pattern is the most delicate and at the same time most sacred moment of the process. In it, the old field still tries to survive, but the new consciousness begins to stabilize. It is a transitional period between two frequencies, one that is saying goodbye and another that is still forming. At first, the feeling is ambiguous. Part of you wants to move forward. Another part insists on staying. Emotions alternate like tides, but with each wave, the dense energy loses a little more strength. The old vibration doesn't disappear suddenly. It dissolves for lack of resonance. This happens when the observer no longer feeds the old cycle with the same emotional attention. Before, each trigger generated an automatic reaction. Now the trigger is perceived, but the response is chosen. This difference changes everything. The pattern only existed because there was emotional fuel to sustain it. When consciousness interrupts the flow of energy that feeds it, it begins to collapse naturally. This collapse is not destructive, it is liberating. What disintegrates is not the essence, but the structures that prevented expansion. The pain that once seemed like punishment now reveals itself as the midwife of consciousness. Each emotion that unwinds makes room for something lighter to occupy the field. The old energy becomes raw material for the new frequency. Nothing is lost, everything is transformed, but there is a subtle detail. The collapse does not happen because you defeated the pattern. It happens because you stopped fighting it. Resistance is the old's food. Acceptance is the light that dissolves it. When the observer allows the pattern to reveal itself without judgment, the structure that sustains it weakens. What was once shadow becomes information. Fear ceases to be an enemy and becomes a messenger. During this process, it is common to feel yourself in a void. What was familiar no longer serves, and the new is not yet consolidated. The mind tries to interpret the void as loss, but in the energetic field, it is the opposite. The void is the open space where the new vibration settles. It is the silence between two songs, the neutral point between one breath and the next. In this space, consciousness learns to inhabit the now without needing to fill everything. Over time, this neutrality stops being uncomfortable and begins to be the natural state. You realize you don't need to react to every stimulus or justify every emotion. The inner field stabilizes. The energy that used to be employed to sustain patterns begins to transform into presence. And this presence has a quiet strength. It reorganizes the surroundings without needing to interfere with them. The collapse of the old pattern is the birth of a new vibrational coherence. The body feels it. The heart beats to another rhythm. The mind begins to adjust to the clarity of consciousness. The outer world responds almost immediately. Situations that used to repeat disappear. Relationships are redefined. Unexpected opportunities arise. Not because the universe has rewarded anything, but because the frequency has changed. The field reorganizes everything to align with the new state. At this point, the observer perceives the power of stillness. Strength is no longer in incessant action, but in sustaining the new field. Reality begins to bend before vibrational coherence. The old loses meaning not because it was overcome, but because it has ceased to be compatible. The cycle unravels due to lack of correspondence. This is the true collapse. The instant you realize you no longer need to struggle to be free. Consciousness replaces effort. Vibration replaces control. Silence replaces fear. And in that silence, the new version of the self is born, not as an achievement, but as a natural consequence of full presence. When the old pattern falls, life expands in all directions. Small gestures change, perception refines, the body breathes with relief. The old energy, once dense, turns into clarity. It is the same field, but with a different signature. And in this new state, what once seemed impossible becomes simple. What once required force now flows. If something inside you recognizes this process, if you feel that an old part is collapsing while a new one begins to reveal itself, allow yourself to remain in this silence. Observe without interfering. Let the energy reorganize. And if this text touched something in you, leave in the comments a simple vibrational affirmation. I am ready to sustain the new field. Write it as a seal of presence, a reminder to the universe and to yourself that the old cycle no longer commands your movement. And if this reflection made sense, like the video, not as an automatic gesture, but as a way to anchor this new vibration in the collective that is also awakening. The new vibration is not sustained by mental clarity alone. It needs to be anchored in the body. The quantum leap does not happen on the plane of ideas, but at the point where emotion and presence meet. While the mind understands the process, the body is what translates it. If emotion vibrates in misalignment, the field fragments and the energy cannot stabilize. It is in this adjustment between feeling and being that the leap becomes possible. Emotion is the fuel of vibration. All creation is born from the emotional energy that sustains it. But when that energy is conducted without consciousness, it turns into a disordered force, a noise that keeps the old pattern alive. Presence, on the other hand, is the silent field where emotion can reorganize. When consciousness observes what it feels without trying to correct or deny it, the vibration begins to align naturally. The common mistake is trying to change emotion through the mind. Think positively, repeat phrases, force states of joy or peace. These practices may bring momentary relief, but they do not produce deep transformation because they still stem from an attempt to control the field. Vibrational coherence is only established when the emotion is felt fully within presence. Feeling is not sinking. It is allowing the energy to complete its cycle. Imagine a sound vibrating in a room. If you try to muffle the sound, it resists. But if you simply listen, the sound echoes, expands, and fades. The same happens with emotion. Emotional discomfort does not ask for a solution. It asks for a witness. When the observer remains present, emotional energy dissipates because it is seen. What is seen does not dominate. What is felt in presence returns to neutrality. The alignment between emotion and presence is an act of inner reconciliation. It requires that you abandon the habit of dividing your emotions into good and bad. Each has a function in the field. Anger shows where energy became imprisoned. Sadness reveals where surrender has not yet happened. Fear points to where trust needs to be born. When consciousness recognizes the role of each emotion without judgment, the field returns to harmony. This alignment does not happen in a single moment. It is a living practice. Each time emotion arises and you observe it without fleeing, a fragment of the old field is integrated. Little by little, the body ceases to be a stage for automatic reactions and becomes an instrument of presence. The vibration that once swung between extremes begins to stabilize. The quantum leap is not a jump in time, but an expansion in consciousness. You cease to be dragged by emotion and become the space where it happens. Presence, in this context, is not immobility. It is lucidity in motion. It is the state in which feeling and observing coexist. When the body feels and consciousness observes, the field becomes coherent. This coherence creates the environment necessary for the vibrational leap, a movement in which energy stops responding to density and starts responding to clarity. The observer then begins to experience synchronicities, expanded perceptions, and a constant sense of lightness. Not because life has become perfect, but because the frequency of reaction has transformed. The leap happens the instant the observer no longer separates emotion from consciousness. Everything is integrated. Fear is felt, but does not dominate. Joy arises, but is not pursued. The body becomes a neutral field of experience, and in that space, energy naturally rises. This elevation is not euphoria, it is stability. The mind, accustomed to highs and lows, finds this constancy strange, but the soul recognizes it. It is the natural rhythm of being. In quantum terms, the leap is the collapse of incoherence. The field stops emitting contradictory signals, wanting something and vibrating the opposite, and begins to radiate a single frequency. This coherent frequency becomes a natural attractor of equivalent realities. Matter responds precisely to the stabilized vibration. What was resistance becomes flow. Aligning emotion and presence is, therefore, learning to breathe with the universe. The air that enters and leaves the body is the same that moves galaxies. When breathing becomes conscious, the body and the field come into sync. The heart becomes the vibrational center of the new frequency, and emotion, once seen as an obstacle, becomes the bridge between the human and the quantum. Presence does not nullify emotion, it transforms it into information. Each sensation, no matter how uncomfortable, brings a message about the state of the field. When the observer listens without reacting, the body begins to respond differently. Energy circulates. The internal rhythm slows. Perception expands. This is true alignment, a state in which feeling does not imprison, but frees. In the vibrational leap, nothing is achieved by effort. Coherence does the work. When emotion and presence walk together, the quantum field reorganizes around that harmony. What used to be struggle becomes attunement. The observer discovers that reality does not need to be controlled. It needs to be understood in vibration. Emotion is the tone, presence is the rhythm, and when both meet, the universe responds in harmony. Sustaining the new vibration is harder than awakening it. The instant of the quantum leap is like a spark, a clarity that lights up suddenly, revealing the breadth of the field. But once the light manifests, the real test comes, remaining in it. The body still carries old vibrational memories, and the mind tries to rebuild the ground it lost. Consciousness needs to learn to remain stable while the old insists on returning, not because it is stronger, but because it is more familiar. The old mental impulses do not disappear immediately. They circle like echoes seeking shelter. Automatic thoughts, comparisons, judgments, doubts, all arise to test the solidity of the new frequency. It is at this point that the observer needs to distinguish between what is the current vibration and what is residue of old energy. When you recognize a recurring thought and choose not to follow it, something powerful happens. The impulse loses its command. The challenge lies precisely in not confusing stability with stagnation. Maintaining the new frequency does not mean suppressing movement, but dancing with it without losing the center. The quantum field is not static, it pulses. Each new situation is an invitation to reaffirm the vibration you decided to sustain. It is common, after an expansion, to feel the density again, not as a setback, but as a test of coherence. The universe always returns experiences compatible with the dominant frequency. If you still react as before, the field understands that the old vibration remains active. Sustaining the new requires silent vigilance. It is not a struggle, it is expanded attention. The mind tries to turn the process into a goal, wants to know if it has arrived, wants to measure progress. But the field does not respond to metrics, it responds to the quality of presence. With each old thought that arises, consciousness has the opportunity to choose, revert to the automatic, or remain in the silence of the new field. It is in this repeated choice that the vibration stabilizes. The hardest mental impulse to dissolve is comparison. When the mind compares, it leaves presence. It begins to measure its own state by the ruler of the past or by the expectation of the future. This movement fragments the energy and makes it oscillate. The new frequency does not support comparison because it lives in the now. Sustaining it requires trust in the inner rhythm, even when nothing seems to be happening. Another subtle impulse is validation. The mind wants external signs that the change worked. It wants the world to confirm the new state, for people to notice, for results to show up. But confirmation never comes from outside. It manifests as inner calm, as the absence of need. When the vibration is real, the external reflection is inevitable, but it comes in the timing of the field, not the timing of the mind. Sustaining the new also means dealing with the discomfort of not knowing. The old pattern gave the mind a false sense of control. The new vibration dissolves that control and replaces it with trust. The transition between these two states is disconcerting because the void of not knowing is fertile but seems threatening. The observer needs to learn to remain in this void with serenity, recognizing that it is the soil where the new reality will form. The mind tries to escape by creating stories. It wants to explain, justify, label the process. The danger lies in believing these narratives. Each label puts the vibration back into the past. When the observer learns to perceive mental movement without identifying with it, a new kind of clarity arises. He understands that thought is not an enemy, just a reflection of the field. From there, instead of trying to eliminate thought, he simply observes it until it dissolves. Maintaining the new frequency is an exercise in coherence between what is known and what is felt. The mind may understand the new paradigm, but the body still needs to learn it. The body is the instrument that anchors the vibration. That is why each conscious breath, each pause, each gesture made in presence is an energetic affirmation. Sustaining the new does not occur only in moments of meditation, but in each small choice, responding calmly, listening without reacting, moving with attention. The subtlest challenge of all is the unconscious return to the old rhythm. When everything seems stable, the mind tries to retake control, disguised as rationality. It says, now that everything is fine, it's safe to relax and go back to acting as before. It is at this point that the new vibration is tested. If consciousness remains awake, the return does not happen. But if the autopilot takes over, the field readjusts to the old frequency. Sustaining the new is keeping the observer awake even in comfort zones. Vibrational stability does not mean the absence of emotion. On the contrary, it means feeling everything without being dominated by anything. The mature field rejects no frequency. It recognizes them, integrates them, and reorganizes them in harmony. The new frequency is alive, pulsing, and conscious. When the observer anchors in this state, there is no more going back. The old impulse may appear, but it no longer drags you along. Sustaining the new field is like learning to walk on a surface that once seemed unstable. At first, attention is needed for each step. Later, the movement becomes natural. The mind finally adapts to the new cadence of consciousness. What once required effort becomes breathing, and at that point, the quantum leap becomes a way of living, not as an extraordinary event, but as the new normal of presence. There comes a point when the past loses its gravity. The same stories that once held you now seem distant, like echoes from a life that no longer recognizes. The memory still exists, but it has lost its density. It is the sign that the old vibration has finally dissolved. The field, once trapped in repetitions, expands in directions that were once invisible. This is true liberation, not erasing the past, but becoming immune to the force with which it once tried to define the present. To live outside repetition is to discover a time that does not repeat. The mind, accustomed to the cycle of cause and effect, is surprised by the fluidity of the new frequency. Automatic reactions disappear, fears lose their echo, expectations disarm. Life begins to respond precisely to the vibration you sustain, not to the pattern you fear. The world ceases to be a testing ground and becomes a mirror of creation. This liberation does not happen in a triumphant instant. It reveals itself through subtle gestures. The tone of the voice changes. The way you breathe transforms. Choices no longer arise from fear, but from clarity. The energy that once scattered in attempts at control now concentrates in presence. The body vibrates with a living peace, not because everything is resolved, but because consciousness has learned to trust the flow. To live outside repetition is to live without the script of survival. The mind, used to measuring risks, seeks safety in repetitions, even if they are painful. When the cycle breaks, it feels lost. But for the first time, the observer does not rush to fill the void. He allows the space to remain open. In that space, the new begins to manifest. It doesn't come with urgency. It comes with precision. What arrives is not born of need, but of vibrational coherence. True freedom is born when the present ceases to be a means to some future. Life ceases to be a race and becomes a field of resonance. Each moment becomes a perfect mirror of your inner state. There is no longer what to do to be, only to be and allow doing to arise. Time reorganizes itself. The now becomes dense and luminous. It is at this point that the quantum flow stabilizes, when the observer realizes that reality responds to the frequency of consciousness, not to its haste. The most curious thing is that, upon leaving repetition, you also free yourself from the need to prove that you've changed. There is no longer the desire to display evolution. because there is no longer anyone who needs convincing. The vibration itself becomes the witness. People around you feel it, even without words, that something has changed. Energy is the language, coherence, the argument. This state is silent, yet unmistakable. It asks for no recognition, only presence. To live outside repetition is to rediscover the pleasure of simplicity. The small things regain meaning: the sound of the wind, the touch of water, the rhythm of breathing. Time ceases to be the enemy and becomes an ally. The hurry, once a symptom of misalignment, dissolves. The observer learns to walk with life, not against it. Everything that comes, comes at the right time. Everything that goes, leaves without pain. Trust replaces control. This trust is not belief, it is direct perception. Consciousness perceives that the field responds to every vibration emitted. When the internal state is clear, the external organizes itself in harmony. When there is internal noise, reality reflects it so it can be seen. The difference now is that the observer does not react. He understands. Learning ceases to be an effort and becomes natural recognition. What once required years of effort now happens in seconds of lucidity. Outside repetition, energy moves in a spiral, not in a circle. Each experience leads to a higher level of integration. Even when similar situations return, they come in a different frequency, revealing new layers of consciousness. The past loses the power to imprison because it becomes living wisdom. Nothing repeats because everything evolves. Life's movement becomes a continuum of discovery, not of correction. The mind tries to understand this state, but it cannot be explained. It must be experienced. The observer feels a lightness that does not depend on circumstances. The body vibrates in harmony, as if every cell recognized the new pattern. The feeling is of being whole, not fragmented between what was and what still wants to be. This wholeness is true quantum freedom. Liberation is not an escape from the world. It is communion with it. You continue living, feeling, deciding, but you do so from a stable center. Life ceases to be a field of defense and becomes a field of expression. Experiences no longer define you. They reveal you. The observer ceases to be reactive and becomes creative. The vibration that once repeated patterns now generates reality. The cycle ends not by resistance, but by completeness. When consciousness reaches this state, reality changes texture. Relationships become transparent mirrors, emotions lose weight, and time expands. You realize that you never needed to fight against the old, only to stop vibrating with it. To live outside repetition is finally to inhabit the field where the new is not a goal, but a nature. And in that place, all that exists is presence, pure, silent, and creative. Quantum change is not an extraordinary event, it is the return to coherence. When the observer understands that everything is born in the inner field, time ceases to imprison. The cycle ends, not through effort, but because consciousness no longer vibrates at the same frequency that created it. In that silence, reality aligns, and life flows again as a natural extension of what is. If you've made it this far, write in the comments, "I choose to remain in the new field," to anchor this vibration. And if this content resonated with you, subscribe. There is much more consciousness waiting to emerge with you.